Shalom and welcome. This is Yitzchak Reuven with Abba Horowitz from the Temple Institute here in Jerusalem, Israel. We are the Temple Institute. We're all about the Holy Temple, past, present, and future. Our website is templeinstitute.org. We have Facebook. We have YouTube videos. We have a Twitter account. We have podcasts. You can actually hear this either on our YouTube channel or on Deezer or Spotify. And we have other social media. We've been answering questions from listeners. We welcome your questions. Please go to our website and go to the contact page and send us your questions. That's the best way to get them to us. That way I will definitely see them. And Abba is going to read a question right now, which is a fascinating question, and we're going to have a lot of fun answering it.
Yes. I just want to say one thing. I bought a coffee today.
Yes.
And usually it's aroma coffee, and usually it's a really good coffee.
Yeah.
And I don't know. This was a terrible coffee.
What happened?
I don't know. I'm trying to figure that out. I'm thinking I'm going to take this coffee back and ask them for another one. I've never had such a bad coffee from Aroma. It was shocking.
Wow.
But I had to point that out. Before I begin, because I've been
glad
drinking
they're not
coffee
one of our sponsors.
while doing the show. Yeah, so I just want to point that out. I just had to get off my chest. I'm sorry. I apologize. Anyway, I'm going to start here with the questions. It's actually a really, really good question. Not that the other questions weren't good, but this one made me really think, and I had to do some research. And what I found was astounding. I thought it was astounding, and I have a lot more research to do. And here's the question. I have a question which has unfortunately been under-scrutinized in the past. Is it known which music was played and sung in the temple?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only the famous description of the temple orchestra and choir from the Mishnah, but particular melodies from this period. What kind of notation was used in the music sheets at that time? I would strongly appreciate your assistance, especially for transmitting me any research papers and audio recordings on the issue in question. So this was a really good question. It made me think. Immediately I went to my primary source, which is Rabbeinu Bechaya, which I've mentioned many times as one of my favorite commentators, who lived in Spain in the 1300s. It's actually buried in Israel in the north, near the grave of Habakkuk, which is one of the prophets, Habakkuk. I don't know in English. How do you say Habakkuk? It's fun to say. It's fun to say Habakkuk.
Yeah.
Anyway, he was, and what he did say, the Rabbeinu Bechaya, was very simple, that the function of the Levium was to bring an element of simcha, of happiness, while the proceedings of the korban were happening, of the offering were happening. While the daily offering were being brought, the Levim, their purpose and function was to sing, and through that singing, through the shir, one would feel simcha, spiritual, obviously spiritual happiness,
joy, happiness, connection. I think that's the best, the best explanation. Connection, dveikut, being at one with Hashem. It's not, happy, frivolous joy, happiness. It's not having a good time. It's really being uplifted and elated because you're right there with God. I mean, when we go up to the Temple Mount, I think we feel a little bit of that.
A little bit, yes.
Yes. You're right there.
Our rabbis say, it's in the Talmud, that the Shechina, the presence of God, can only rest when there's happiness. When we're sad, He's not going to rest. His Shechina won't be with us. And it's the same idea of nevuah, prophecy. If you don't have simcha, you can't receive prophecy. If you don't have happiness, you can't receive prophecy. So that's the function, but this doesn't really answer the question. And so I started to do more research, and one of the books that was put out recently in the last, I think, 20 years is a book called Shiltei Gibarim, which are essentially the great rulers, or it's actually taken from Song of Songs. And actually there's a couple books called Shiltei Gibarim. It's not the only one. But this was of an Italian scholar. And if I may give a little background on the Italians. After the Italians, a lot of the Italian Jews moved there from Spain after they were kicked out in the late 1400s. And what happened was they had gone through their own turmoil. And there was almost this feel that they were on the cusp of redemption. And so they started to study all the issues of the temple, believe it or not. There's actually a lot of books from that period of time came out of Italy on the temple. And the rabbi of this book called Shiltei Gebarim, his name was Rav Avraham Harofei, and his English name, or I guess it would be either Spanish or Italian name, was Portaleone. Sounds very Italian, okay?
Yeah.
Sounds like he could be in the mafia.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll have one of those.
Anyway, he lived from 1542 to 1612, and his rabbi too was one who wrote a very famous book on the temple as well. So he was both a doctor and a great scholar. And just so you should know, this is actually during a period where the church had actually burned most of the sets of Talmud. Post this period of time is when Rav Avraham Harofei was actually writing this book. He talks about how he was part of a group that had hidden the Talmud, and they were able to study it with it freely, despite most people not having access to Talmuds. So it's an interesting period of time. So interesting, it was also during the period of the Renaissance.
Right.
And so in addition to being a great scholar, a great Talmud Chacham, and writing Sfarim, etc., and being a doctor, he was also a Renaissance man.
Right.
So he knew music,
Yeah.
he knew Latin, he knew Greek, he knew botany, he knew literally everything, and that's really what's in the book. He identifies the different, the different spices in the Ketaret, and he gives you in his 4th chapter. If anyone has access to this book, it's not translated to English to the best of my knowledge, but in the 4th chapter he talks about music and the Levim, and I got to tell you something. It blew my mind because I never thought about this. So whoever wrote this question, I'm not going to say your name over air just in case you don't want us to mention your name, but thank you for this question because it opened the whole thing. And I'm a drummer, so I've been with music my whole life, and I can really appreciate this. So he goes into a lot of sophisticated ideas about music. Most of them I didn't understand, okay, about notes and how they work and all. I think you would need probably to be a professor of music to understand what he was talking about. But the basic point is like this, and this is really, the music of the temple was super sophisticated because the Levim, if you remember, it says that they were 5 years in school.
Right.
Now, their function was to be the Shomrim, the guards, and the Shoarim, the ones who open and close the gatekeepers, okay? You don't need 5 years of schooling to do that.
Right.
We can teach you that in 5 minutes. The schooling mainly was probably the halachot of the Mikdash, the laws of the Mikdash, but in addition was music, to getting these people to sing the correct notes to the correct tunes. And this is what essentially the Shiltei Gebarim, Rav Avraham Harofei deals with the whole time, is the music and how sophisticated it was. Having two people sing at a certain level, raising their voices, lowering their voices, and he actually brings verses from Chronicles, Divrei Yamim, to actually prove exactly, the people overseeing this, how sophisticated it was. Unfortunately, we don't really have this music today that we can put our hands on and say these were the tunes. But what we do know is they were super sophisticated. In addition to the Shiltei Gebarim, there's a sefer that someone gave to me one day.
A book.
A book, and it was written by this guy all about song in Judaism, in Hebrew, with a lot of sources. He was obviously a great scholar, great Talmud Chacham. He's still alive. He actually lives in Jerusalem. And I've been meaning to actually call him, but in the book, he talks more about, he brings sources too from medieval times that King David, as we know, he had a harp, right? We talk about his harp, and he wrote Tehillim, and Psalms, and in Psalms, there's many different types of Psalms. There's Shir, there's Zemer, there's...
Shir and Zemer can either be translated, each one as song,
right?
But they're different
words. Different types.
So it means something...
To give you an idea, Lam Natseach, right? Mizmor Shir. Lam Natseach means to the conductor.
Right.
We know there was a conductor.
Right.
And they even try to prove that the conductor had a stick. Reminiscent of regular conductors. Mizmor Shir. There's Mizmor and there's Shir. These are two different things. The idea being is you had to know how to sing these different verses. And that David HaMelech received these ideas. He was the one, just as he received through his Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit of God, Ruach HaKodesh, he received the Tehillim. He wrote Tehillim Psalms. He too received how to compose the music to fit exactly for the temple. Now that is wild. And obviously the tunes there are something that we don't have handle on right now. And
although they're out there,
as
music doesn't disappear.
Right, one would have to believe it's still out there. As we know that when they went into Galut, right, exile, the Levim, they bit off their thumbs.
Right.
And, because they knew how to make certain sounds with their thumbs.
They were commanded by the Babylonians to sing, about while we have a festive meal to celebrate your exile.
Right.
And they bit off their thumbs so they couldn't possibly sing.
So again, it's out there. I agree with Yitzchak that certainly they're out there, and we have to find these songs. But the composition, how to use these songs to get the right mood. There were moods that were needed for simcha, for happiness, and those obviously, how do you get that? And how do you get to that mood that everyone's going to feel that way?
Yeah.
But there's also times when a person brings in a korban chatat, a sin offering,
and they have to feel
solemn.
Yeah. Solemn.
Right. And the Levim had to sing in a way that they would feel this way, but not too depressed, where the point at the end they would have to get into a point of simcha because the person now will be forgiven. I
want to mention to you at this point, just an aside, that when a person brought an offering, it wasn't simply a mechanical thing. You bring the offering, you do it, you slaughter it, you put it on the altar, and everything's hunky-dory. You had to feel what you were trying to achieve. And so if a person brought a sin offering, they were trying to atone for a sin, they had to feel that solemnness. It had to be real to them. They couldn't simply just go through the motions. And so the music was an essential component of inspiring in the individual or in the tzibor, in the general public, the actual spiritual mood that they needed to be in order to achieve what was trying to be achieved through the offering.
Correct. And if anyone wants to look at this further, I would suggest you go to Chronicles 1, because there's Chronicles 1 and 2, Aleph and Bet, and this would be in the 15th chapter, and really start from the beginning of the chapter, but here's one of the key verses that's so interesting. So the head of the Levim that sang, in other words, the head of the musicians, his name was Kinanyahu. Ukinanyahu sar haleviim b'masa yasor b'masa ki mevin hu. Now the words masa here and the other words it's hard to understand what they mean. So if we look at the commentaries here, so what they explain is that he was the sar of the Levim, he was the prince of the Levim, he's obviously the head of the Levim, b'masa. What's masa? So they explain that of understanding how the music works, how to raise your voice, lower your voice, how to use the different voices.
Right.
To get that sound, that right sound, that correct sound. Ki mevin hu, at the end it says, he understood. So the Radak, who was an early commentator in the 1200s, actually says he actually had nevuah. He had a sense of prophecy of understanding the right sounds at the right moments and the right music and composition to do at those right moments during the service in the temple.
So are you suggesting that they were what's the word we use in jazz? They were, when you're making it up as you go along, that there was some kind of improvisation?
A flow? Interesting. Well, maybe it was like a jam, a temple jam.
It's, you mentioned the Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, prophecy, and that's what music is.
Yeah.
Music is so spiritual.
Correct.
It's not a big leap to, obviously, anybody who comes up with a beautiful tune, a beautiful song, wow, how did they do that? And lots of times musicians explain, it just came to me, or I woke up and it was in my head. I think these explanations are so real. We were talking about this a little earlier, and you mentioned that there was a differentiation in understanding the music between the vocal music and the instrumental music.
Yes.
And that the vocal music was really the basis of it. That's what had to be convey the mood, the feeling, and that's what the Levites, the Leviim that's what they studied for 5 years.
That's correct. In Daf Yomi, actually, there was recently in Masechet Sukkah, Tractate Sukkah, the discussion was Ikar Shira Bepeh or Ikar Shira Bekli. What was the key part of this music? Was it singing?
Vocal or
exactly,
or
vocal
instrumental.
or instrumental? Interesting enough, is that the people who stood on the duchan, on the platform there
Right.
to sing.
They would sing on the platform just inside the Nicanor gate, which was the gate separating
Correct.
the women's court from the inner court where the altar was.
Correct, right near the altar.
Right.
And those could only be Levites.
Mhm.
However, the music, the Gemara says, and that's the way we posek halacha, that's we render the halacha, the law, is it could actually be Levim who played the instruments as well as certain kinds of Yisraelim, meaning they came from families that were fit to marry into Levite or Kohanic families. Hamisin lekahuna is what here says. Mehen Levim, sorry, I'll just quote it from the Maimonides so I don't misquote it. There were some Levim, umehen Yisraelim. There were actually Israelites that could play the instruments, but they had to be miyuchasin. They had to have a certain family status, hamisin lekuna, that they were on the level that they could marry kohanim. It means they couldn't be mamzerim, they couldn't be, certain kinds of people from families, and they would actually play the instruments, and that's very interesting. So you see that the key part was for the Levim was the singing aspect.
And we have the wonderful story of Yonah.
Correct.
The prophet Jonah, who was not a prophet, and he participated in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, the all night, every night of Sukkot's festivity, party, song and dance, juggling fire, torches, all sorts of a wonderful celebration, which created, and people at that, I think during Sukkot, people were invited to bring their own instruments and jam with the Levites, and people, I think, would build instruments for the occasion and sometimes come up with something completely new, something unique, and it created such an overflow of simcha, like an ecstatic joy that Yonah, who was there,
The ultimate jam.
His wife sent him there. There's a story with his wife. His wife's part of the story.
Yes, I don't remember it.
I don't remember the detail, but
Yonah came from the north. He was actually lived in the north of Israel.
He came to the temple and he left, electrified. He
Correct.
had nevuah. He had prophecy.
And
then
freaked out. And freaked out.
Yes, and freaked out. That's that's the background to the story. Why God said do this, and he said, I can't do that. Like, you got to be, you talking to me? But that's the background. The music must have been so unbelievably compelling. We have a few videos on our YouTube channel that were recorded about 15 years ago by David Lewis, who is no longer with us, unfortunately. And he was a professional musician who had also studied the music of the temple. And he talks about these things. We have half a dozen videos. You do a search on our YouTube channel and you'll find them. They're also very fascinating about this topic. And again, music doesn't disappear. So
notes are notes.
Notes are notes. Those songs are out there. We just have to identify them and reclaim them.
Some say that was the idea of the great Rebbes, that from the Baal Shem Tov, that they would bring in all these nigunim,
these wordless
songs, tunes, and that many of these tunes that they brought, some people said, well, like one of them, for example, in Chabad, it's called Napoleon's March. And you have others that have other weird names to them, Hop Cossack, and you have all these other names that don't seem very Jewish. And like, what are you doing? Why are you bringing these into? And the idea behind it is again, I read this in a book. I don't know how reliable the source is. It's in the same book that he quoted a great master, a great Rebbe, who claims that these were essentially the tunes from the Mikdash, from the temple period, and that great rabbi, with his Ruach HaKodesh, right, because he's on a very high level, this Rebbe, and he understood, wow, this is a song from the temple period. Let's make it our own again. Let's take it back into us. I can't tell you if that's true or not, but it could very well be true. As we said, the music's out there, so why not? Again, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I really have to have a conversation with Rabbi Yisrael Ariel on this from the Temple Institute, because I've never discussed this with him. What will we do? The Rav likes to solve all problems. Not problems. He likes to find solutions for all the questions, right? There's no problems, there's solutions. and really, what will be the Levium in that period. What songs can we sing? Will they be Karlebach music, or does it have to be as Rav Avram Arofei of the Shiltei Gebarim says, it was super sophisticated with very specific guidelines that were based on Ruach HaKodesh. So it will be very interesting. I definitely want to revisit this idea, this topic, and I will do more research and discuss it with the Rav.
I'll just add one last thing, that in this temple courtyard, where the Levites sung, it was a closed area. And one side had the front, the facade of the Mikdash itself, which was massive. It must have itself created a specific, it was like an amphitheater. It must have had its own acoustics, which, again, were totally unique to the temple.
Correct.
And I'm sure that the Levites learned, one of the things they learned was how to utilize that to its best advantage. Again, this is like a bottomless subject.
Bottomless. If I could just one final add to what you're saying, because it's a really good point, is the Mikdash, obviously everything is very specific in terms of the measurements, very exact. And as the Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, who authored the Mesilat Yesharim.
Another Italian. You see, this Italian's there. He wrote a book called Mishkanei Elyon on the temple. Right.
And he actually, in that book, he talks about how each measurement of the temple is an offshoot of the name of God. Wow. And he shows it. Everything is divisible by Yud K Vav K. What is it? Tetragrammaton?
Tetragrammaton.
Right. So, Hey, Yud is 10, Hey is 5, and Vav is 6. Right. And you'll see that every measurement in the tractate Midot is actually an offshoot of one of those numbers connecting to God. So one has to assume that the measurements being that exact way would project the music of the Levim in a much more spiritual way, if you really think about it.
Yeah. Again, there's just so many endless questions. I know that there's different scales and different, it's just like I'm not an expert. But again, the Shiltei Giborim was the one book, because the person who asked the question was asking also for references. It's in
Fourth
Hebrew.
Chapter.
And what was the other book? Do you have the title of the other book that you were referring to?
I think I have it at home. It's called something Shirim Vizmirot or something like that. But it's not something sold in a shop. Someone actually gave it to me. It was like a guy who privately wrote this book. Phenomenal book. It's like 1,000 pages, all about shir, song, in our religion. Actually, everything to do with shir. What does it mean? What does Az Yashir mean? When we say Az Yashir, the prayer of Az Yashir, what does that even mean? Hazinu, which we're going to be saying, what does that mean? This is so. What are all these things? What are they? And he explains them, but really in depth, and brings some actually incredible sources. So this topic's not over.
Right.
We're going to continue with it. Great question, and keep them coming.
Keep them coming. Thank you so much for being with us. Temple Jam.